I'm Brian Hyde, and today we're going to be talking about why you have to watch what they do. Now, I'm talking about elected officials primarily, legislators to be specific. They're so good at talking the talk. Boy, they can spin stories and tell you tales that'll make your head swim and make you love them enough to vote for them. But will they actually do what they promise to do? Well, that's a slightly different matter. We'll get to that in just a moment.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, we welcome you to Know Where to Hide. Yeah, the legislative session is wrapping up. It's really interesting. I was party to a conversation today where several people have observed this is a pretty tough legislative session, meaning there are some things that are being fought very, very hard. And all the legislators who run on conservative values and you can vote for me because I'm a good conservative Idahoan, fifth generation, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't mean anything if their votes don't reflect what their words are saying. But don't take my word for it. In fact, I really hope you won't. Let's see what Idaho Freedom Foundation President Ron Nate has to say. This is a great article about actions, words, and the true conservative. And he gives us a couple of very workable examples to see this. Ron says, occasionally a bill or two comes before the Idaho legislature, truly showing the principles of the legislators voting for it versus those voting against it. So, for instance, he gives two bills this session, House Bill 468, the Rangeland Improvement Act, and House Bill 595, Outcomes-Based Education. Now, House Bill 468 would establish what they call a rangeland improvement account in the state treasury and instruct the Idaho Department of Agriculture to seek appropriation and to receive contributions, gifts, and grants for the purpose of carrying out the provisions of this chapter. So, in short, the bill would expand government, spend more money, make Idaho more dependent on the federal government to the benefit of a particular interest group, in this case, ranchers. So does that sound like a conservative proposal to you? All right, here's another example. He says the second bill, H595, would allocate school funds based on student performance in grades 5 through 8. So students who demonstrate improvement or sustained proficiency in math will draw more money to their districts and their schools. So while spending north of $3 billion on public education already, student performance is abysmal. It's not improving. And as usual, the task, or the proposal rather, is to throw more money at it to supposedly incentivize educators to do the job they've already been given. But better? Well, it spends money, it expands bureaucracy, and it does it in a system already immune to monetary incentives. And again, does this sound like a conservative proposal to you? Now, here's the point that he's making. Conservative candidates will tell you they're for limited government, for reducing taxes, restoring freedoms, protecting individual rights. These bills come very close to testing the convictions of candidates claiming to be conservative. Both bills are affronts to conservative values and are real-time, tip-of-the-spear litmus tests. Many legislators fail these tests. Now, for a more comprehensive view of conservative claims versus conservative actions, he invites you to go to the Idaho Freedom Index to see how legislators' votes on hundreds of bills stack up against the freedom and conservative principles that those bills affect. Things like limited government, lower spending, protecting rights, expanding freedom, being free of federal control. Ron says actions speak louder than words. At the Idaho State House, words are plenty and words are deceptive, but the votes don't lie. So be informed, follow the IFF Research and Freedom Index, and be powerful. Now, maybe this will surprise you, but the Idaho Freedom Foundation has some very powerful enemies in the press as well as certain elected officials. Why is it? Well, because in part, they hold them accountable for not only the words they speak, but what their actions actually do. Do they line up with those so-called conservative principles? And you know what? In many cases, they don't. So a word to the wise, don't be fooled just because some politician says they're going to do something but then does something either way out of character or worse still, actually plays for the other team. In fact, here's a great tweet that I saw earlier. This is from Brandy. Yamamoto, Souter, McCann, Treggy, Burnt, Furness, Lanting, Guthrie, Perry, Garner, Blanksma. These are Idaho legislatures looking at you in response to Mike Lee's observation. If you wear the red jersey but intentionally score points for the blue team, you are the problem. That's beautifully said. And unfortunately, we have an effort underway right now in Idaho that's trying to blur the lines and make sure that everybody, isn't wearing either a red or a blue jersey. We're all going to be some color of purple. That's if ranked choice voting and open primaries go through. All right, here's a good example of some of the things that are being proposed to the legislature, and in this case, here's one that's argued against. Senator Melissa Wintrow debates forcefully against House Bill 668, no public funds for gender transition. In fact, she denounces traditional, dominant gender roles that, regardless of what this body says, are socially constructed. And by the way, Representative Heather Scott nails it. Genders are constructed by God. Cultural Marxists, such as Senator Wintrow, want to be God, but they never will be. But they sure fight hard for all of those weird left-wing causes. Here's another thing. Just keep in mind, our neighboring state, Washington State's governor, has signed a bill mandating LGBT history be taught in public schools. I wonder why they would want to do that. Captive audience, compulsory education laws. Wake up, America, says Wall Street Silver. They are coming for your children. And again, Representative Heather Scott warns, don't think for a second they don't have similar plans for Idaho. The question is, will your legislators talk the talk or will they walk the walk of being a true conservative? Because they always seem to have multiple excuses. They can't just give you a straight answer. No, I wouldn't support that, and here's why. There's all this equivocation. Well, we got to think about this, and it's possible that maybe we have to clear the decks here for an upcoming election, and I don't know what to do, before they finally support whatever it is that's anti-freedom, anti-family, or whatever. Actions speak louder than words. This is one of those cases where you've really got to pay close attention. So sometimes we hear complaints about, well, what about these bills? They're addressing a problem that hasn't even really arisen yet. Okay, Senator Brian Lenny actually gives you a very good explanation for why they advocate for preemptive laws, like his bill that successfully passed in the Senate, House Bill 572, which aims to prevent the implementation of universal basic income, UBI, programs in Idaho. Why are they doing this? Because these are things that are being proposed, because these are things that could be brought to light or could be brought to the legislature unless somebody puts a firm foot down and draws that line in the sand and says this is not going to happen here. Now in Canada, if you remember what happened to the Canadian truckers, basically their banking laws make it very easy for people's money to be attacked if they're not being obedient. In fact, I think one of the reasons that Senator Lenny is saying Canada is screwed right now is because they are rolling out a social credit score that ties directly to how obedient people are. What a nutty thing. Anyway, let's move on here. A couple other things going on that you need to be aware of. Just this reminder too, the ones who are asking to be left alone, we're not the extremists. The ones demanding we comply or lose all of our rights, those are the extremists. Now, I want to share with you some thoughts from Brian Ullman, and this is following up on Dr. Ryan Cole's Capital Clarity appearance yesterday, which, by the way, was huge. There were so many people tuned into that, as well as people who showed up to hear him speak, and for good reason. But it comes down to a matter of form versus substance, and Brian Ullman just does a beautiful job of lining this out. He says, which is more important, the form of a thing or the substance, the cover of the book or the content, perception or reality? He says, I started thinking about this idea at the caucus earlier this month. Much of the debate over a primary versus a caucus stemmed from a question of when should Idaho take place in the presidential nominating contest. Had we waited until May, as the Secretary of State intended when he supported House Bill 138 last year, then Idaho Republicans would have had no reason to participate. Most presidential nominations are already sewn up well before the third Tuesday in May, so there's really no reason to bother voting, right? Now, Brian goes on to say, what I learned talking to people at the caucus is that for some, that doesn't matter. They just want to cast their vote in a box because that's part of the American tradition. And he says, that struck me as odd. I think in many ways, our society places more priority on the form than on the substance. He says, I remember a thought experiment I posted on Twitter many years ago in which I asked if it would be better to live under a benevolent dictator who protected our liberties than the totalitarian oligarchy we have today, but still have the right to vote. How do you suppose people answered that question? Yeah, some people threatened violence for the mere suggestion of not being able to vote. So clearly, he says, most people find the act of casting a ballot to be of sacred importance, no matter whether it actually impacts the way our governments run. It's the same thing with firearms. He says, I saw a discussion rather on Twitter recently about how the Second Amendment has in some way lulled us into a false sense of security. We believe that because we're an armed population, we would never allow the sort of tyranny that took over Russia, China, Cuba, and many other less fortunate nations. But then he points out just 4 years ago, our government shut down our schools, churches, and businesses. They arrested people for praying in public or visiting the park. Yeah, the Second Amendment didn't stop them. In fact, when several thousand unarmed Trump supporters protested what they called a stolen election, our government portrayed it as the worst insurrection since the Civil War and have been hunting down and arresting attendees ever since. The Second Amendment didn't stop that either. So once again, he says we hold on to form despite lacking the substance. Now, the healthcare establishment decided very early on that some things were unquestionable dogmas. So this is what Ryan Cole talked about yesterday. Masks are essential. Social distancing is necessary. Ivermectin is for horses. Vaccines should be mandatory. Remember that? I know it's been a few years, but that's exactly what they did. And rather than allowing any of these dogmas to be questioned, as scientific theories should be, governments at every level enforced them at the barrel of a gun. Skeptics were accused of being stupid or evil or both. Anyone stepping outside without a mask was accused of wanting to murder people. Aren't you glad that somebody pushed back? Dr. Cole pointed out that Idaho had one of the lowest COVID vaccination rates in the nation, for which he was personally pilloried. Yet we also had one of the higher survival rates as well. Now, to the healthcare bureaucrats, it didn't matter. Why? Because all they wanted was needles in arms, because they decided that was the only measure that they cared about. So one of the things that Ryan Cole brought up, and I'm sure for some people, they probably thought this was an applause line. He said, my willingness to speak up and to say something has cost me my career. Now, some people would say, well, gee, you should never do that. But okay, I'm going to ask you, are some things worth doing the right thing? Is there a point where you would say, look, I can't participate in this. My conscience will not allow me to do so, even if it meant you had to step away from polite society? I fear for too many people, the answer is, well, I don't know. Let me lift my finger and put it up in the wind and see which way, the wind is blowing. Thank goodness for principled individuals. There are very, very few of them. Dr. Ryan Cole is one of them. And it gives me a lot of satisfaction to see that he's still out there, right? They haven't put him in the gulag just yet, but he's still out there speaking the truth. And more importantly, he's been vindicated. You want to see a good example of what that vindication looks like? All right, you got to check this out. This was an actual tweet. In fact, this was the most popular tweet that the FDA ever posted on X, formerly Twitter. You are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it. Okay, this is why you should not use ivermectin to treat or prevent COVID-19. But wait, here's a news story that just came up just yesterday, and oh my goodness. Remember when ivermectin won a Nobel Prize and had decades of data showing its safety and effectiveness, and the FDA called it a horse drug during COVID because its big pharma vax sponsors told it to? Well, a federal court just ruled the FDA broke the law and needs to delete its propaganda. In other words, the truth about the COVID cartel keeps coming out. This is a story from the Gateway Pundit. FDA loses its war on ivermectin, agrees to remove all related social media content and consumer advisories on ivermectin usage for COVID-19. Wow. So, truth is not something that's going to come to you from someone in authority. Morgan Romero at KTV will probably disagree. Well, we can't say anything about anything unless someone in authority has told us it's okay to say so. But thankfully, there are alternatives and a growing number of alternatives too. That can give you good, credible information. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to still vet the information or do fact checking yourself, but you have alternatives. All that legacy media, all that spin doctor machine that's supposed to keep you and I, with our blinders on, so we aren't questioning the narrative. Yeah, they're guarding gates for which there are no fences. So let them stand there, standing guard. You can't pass here. That's okay. We'll just walk around you and get what we need anyway. But it starts with you and me being willing to think about what we're hearing, think about what we're reading, question it seriously, and most importantly, hold accountable those people in power, not for what they say, but for what they actually do. Sometimes that can be the hard part, but that is what is required. And if we're going to maintain our liberties, it's going to require every single person who participates in their civic duty to think a little more clearly and a little more independently and stop being so trusting of politicians. They're going to tell you whatever they need to tell you to get you to vote for them. They're going to do whatever they need to do to keep the money flowing from their special interests and their supporters to keep them in power. That's a pretty amoral way to go about doing business, but that is how politics is conducted. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing